welcome to the inaugural episode of Figuring Out Fabric, where I ask dumb questions and you get smart answers. Hopefully, anyway. And my first guest is Kristyna. So, you are a Microsoft MVP, you're a solution architect at P3 Adaptive, and you're just kind of fun to be around. So, I'm
Oh,
looking. It's true. Yeah, I don't know. You're always like just very, very uplifting or warm, or I don't know the way to put it. I'm bad with words, but
well, I like
so.
hanging out with you too, Eugene.
Yes.
It's a mutually beneficial relationship.
Finally. If only there was like a word for that, right?
Friendship?
Friendship? Yeah. Jinx. I have to ask, how is it working at P3 Adaptive? Because
Oh,
I listen to the podcast occasionally, and it sounds real like fancy and prestigious, but like how is it behind the scenes?
oh, it's a bunch of nerds.
No,
It's amazing. I love it. Yeah.
very nice.
Yeah, it's a bunch of nerds who started a company with a bunch of other nerds. They call them data geners. But I think I love it.
Yeah,
It's a good group of people with a good goals, and I love that.
that's
They're
awesome.
all about helping other people. Yeah.
Very cool. So you're going to help me understand data movement in Fabric, and just to set the stage, um, up until about 2 weeks ago, I could not tell anyone successfully the when to use either Power Query data pipelines or Spark notebooks in Fabric, and it very much felt like I don't know. Did you ever see that scene in the Titanic where they have all the cutlery out, and he's like, "Oh, what do I do with all this?" And the woman next to him's like, "Well, you just work from the outside in, right?"
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like that's been my thing is like, okay, so you start with like your salad fork, which is Power Query,
Yeah.
and then you work your way up to like your entree fork, which is pipelines, and then when you need like a real tool, then your dessert. I don't know why you need a dessert fork, but your dessert fork is Spark, right? Like that's about as for the longest time, like I guess. Um, and then about 2 weeks ago, I had to give a live training. The first day was on Fabric, so I had to at least like do some research. And
Nice.
then over this past week, um, I just enjoy misery, so I did a benchmarking uh, blog post, and so I at least tested some Spark. I ran into some issues with data flows in terms of performance,
Yep.
and I did some pipeline stuff. So I've gotten my hands a little bit dirtier, but still fairly lost. So hoping you can help out.
I think I can. So
Okay.
I actually like to think of it. I love your fork analogy, but I think of it more as like lobster. Like when I'm
Okay.
eating lobster, canned crab or canned lobster, imitation, whatever you want to call it,
Oh yeah.
that to me is data flows.
Yeah,
It
yeah, yeah.
works, you get it done quick, but the quality is not amazing,
Quick,
right? It's not
quick,
very scalable.
quick aside.
Yeah.
So I grew up poor, or at least partly, right? So my parents were separated. So when I visit my mom, like our meals, because I would visit her on the weekends, would be like mac and cheese, instant mashed potatoes, and then
Yum.
imitation crab, right?
Oh.
And so it was years. I probably my mid 20s when I first had like real crab. I feel like I don't know. And so for me, like that, it's pollock is the fish, and then they just like put crab juice on it and stuff. In my head is what crab tastes like, and
Oh no.
so that's probably how. And maybe that's the same with Power Query. Like that's my favorite tool, but that makes sense. So sorry, go ahead.
No, you're great. I mean, I didn't have real crab until my first past summit.
Oh wow,
Um, yeah, doing. I also don't like seafood, so it was kind of a big jump for me to go to a lobster pot kind of dinner
gotcha,
anyway.
gotcha.
But
Yeah,
no, I loved it. But yeah, so I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, where it's like, yeah, it works, it's familiar, it's
yep,
dependable to for the most part, but if you are trying to get something done at the highest quality, that's not usually what you're going to pick up, right?
right.
So when we move into pipelines, if we go into that data movement strategy, that's kind of like you've got real lobster, but it's been cooked and the tail is kind of out,
Yeah,
it's like kind of packaged and you can just eat it right away.
right,
I think of notebooks as you're cracking the legs. You know what I mean? Like it's a little bit more work, but you can get really fine tuned with it, right? You might get more
right.
out of it that way. You get a lot more out of it typically. So you kind of got these scales of like complexity and quality and knowing where you need to fall in that is really tricky. But
Yeah, no, I mean, and that makes a lot of sense. And it's hard. One of the frustrations I have around sometimes some of the discussions is people will maybe say that more options is better. But there's an
right,
opportunity cost in figuring out like which one to go with. And there's an opportunity cost in understanding, like it took me a while to understand, was it just a skill and preference thing, right?
right,
And they're interchangeable. Like, is it crab versus lobster, or is it something where okay, no, there's a meaningful difference? And I mean, it sounds
yeah.
like there is. There's a pretty meaningful difference in terms of usability and performance and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and you've seen that too, even in your benchmarking tests. I
Yeah.
mean, it does come down to, what's scalable, what's going to be performant, and at the end of the day, what's maintainable.
Right.
So I think that's something that people don't talk about enough. Sure, if you know that you want to go to notebooks in the future, you might want to start there. But if nobody on your team knows how to write Python,
Yes.
if nobody on your team is comfortable with a notebook and they see it as this black box, don't let a consultant come in and install that for you because you're never going to be able to maintain it. And data
Yeah.
changes constantly.
Is
You
it
need
scalable with
maintenance.
people, right?
Yeah.
Like, have you met Johnny Winter from Grayscale Analytics?
Yeah. Oh gosh,
So he
so
was,
cool.
yeah. Well, he was teasing me on the Slack because I did some initial benchmarks and my numbers were off, but it looked like data flows might be an order of magnitude more expensive for what I was trying to do. Now, I probably wasn't taking advantage of fast copy, so there'll be some follow up. But let's assume it was. He was like, "Well, how much would it cost a analytics engineer to figure it out and set the thing up?" And I'm like, and I sincerely, I'm like, if it takes them more than half an hour to figure out how to move the data, the
Yeah.
company has lost money, right? Because yes, maybe that data flow, like let's assume the worst case scenario, and my numbers were right, it would have been $15 to move 194 gigabytes of CSVs via data flows, right?
Mhm.
Even in that worst case scenario, how much are you paying for an analytics engineer? Like how much
Right.
are you paying on someone trying to learn Python from the ground up? And so you're right, like yes, maybe it's $15 for that initial load, but you can easily waste 100 or $200 on people spinning their wheels. Or if they pay for one of us, now they're
Yeah.
spending $200 for an hour
A hundred
or
percent.
45 minutes, right? So I I will say like my dog Tyson's barking. Hopefully he's not getting picked up.
I can't
Um
hear him. Yeah.
good, awesome. Um so um I will say that believe it or not, I saw the light bulb went off and I saw the vision of Fabric when it came to Power Query
Mm.
because I deal with small data. I do not deal with big data. I think the largest data set I've dealt with was like 100, maybe 300 million rows, and we're
Nice.
talking tens of gigabytes, like nothing crazy. Um, and all my customers are like small, medium businesses. And when I realized, like, oh, data flows Gen 2 is just Power Query, but then when you get to the SQL endpoint, you can do a visual SQL query.
Yeah.
It's just
It's just
Power Query.
Power Query.
Because you look at the
Yeah.
SQL it generates, and first you're like, that's ugly as sin. And then you're like, but I know that ugly. I've seen
Yep.
that ugly before. No human puts a dollar sign before a table name. I know exactly where that came from, right? But
Yep.
I got really excited because the idea the idea of asking a business user to work within the equivalent of Databricks is just
It's
insane,
overwhelming.
right?
Yeah.
But to be able to, the fact that Microsoft is going, calm down. You're used to the tip of the iceberg with Power BI. We're just expanding the iceberg a little bit. You can still use the tools you know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit slower, maybe it's a little bit less performant, but you know what's really unperformant? The project failing because it never gets to the finish line, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think people are underestimating the number of projects that get 6 months of work and
yeah.
never come to fruition, right? And that, little shameless plug, but that's one of the things that really attracted me to P3 is they have this faucets first mentality. So
Okay.
you start with where the water needs to come out and you just
Okay.
attach a weird hose to it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then once
yeah.
you figure out that the water is useful and can get there and is clean, then you go back and build all the pipes.
Well, and that makes sense to me because you've probably dealt with this, but one of the most challenging things with writing reports is nobody knows what they want. So
Yes.
like code it'll compile, you can write unit tests. It may make mistakes, but you'll get an error message.
Mhm.
Data, you can look at the resulting data, you can see if it looks like what you expect. Reports don't compile, right?
No.
Yeah. And there's an apocryphal quote from Ford of when he invented the T model, the T80, T90, I don't even know. The Ford. He's
I'm
like,
not a
if
car person,
no,
sorry.
no, I'm not either. But the original car, right?
Yeah.
There's a quote that's been attributed to him that's apocryphal that probably didn't happen, but it's if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And so
Yeah.
when you're doing
Oh.
report design, people ask you for faster horses. And so BI is, from my experience working in IT and doing some software development, it's the most prone to scope creep
Yep.
and it's the most iterative out of
Yes.
like all these IT things. Like you just have to assume that first iteration is wrong.
Yeah.
And so you either build a vertical slice or like you kind of described, let's get a minimum viable product because we know we're going to have to iterate. And then, like you said, later we can work our way back and push stuff upstream or do something that's performant instead of like some ugly SQL query or something.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Because you don't want to have to. I mean, worst nightmare is that scope creep gets back into data engineering.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think as report developers, if you haven't figured this out already, you're going to,
Yeah.
that everything you do is not quite right. I think that in data engineering, there is less room for that, right? Similar to when you're laying down a foundation in a house,
Sure.
you need those forms to be kind of ready. You can't really adjust the concrete later. I
But I
can
was
change the paint
I
later,
was
you
I was
know?
told I was told with data lakes we just shove it in there and then we schema on read. Are you telling me I was lied to? Are you telling me that there's engineering in data engineering? Is that what?
Yeah. Oh, it
No.
depends, you know?
No, but I think you're right. Like the cost of changing the shape of a chart or the color
Yeah.
is far more minimal than changing the data type on a type. And it's so platform dependent too. So
Yeah.
um have you ever, probably not, but have you ever poked at the Contoso generated data set from the Italians?
I've poked at it. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Not
So
to the extent you have.
no,
I've
yeah.
seen some of the
Well,
stuff you've done. Yeah.
well, I'm like, I need big data, right?
Yeah.
Because the whole, so as an aside, but it'll work its way back. The whole reason I started doing the benchmarking is they announced SQL databases in Fabric,
Yes.
and there was this whole rigmarole on some discussion lists about like, okay, is this better for Power BI import
Mm.
or Lakehouse or whatever? And I'm like, well, maybe I'll do some benchmarking. And I was advised, like, if you really want to be testing that scale, you need like a billion rows. You need big data. Otherwise, you're just testing the plumbing and not the efficiency, right?
Right.
Um, and so I'm
Which is
like, okay,
crazy, by the way, that
yeah,
you have very small differences until you get to a billion rows.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, I need big data, and I don't know, the whole like TPC-H stuff never appealed to me. The Stack Overflow database, like it's hard to relate. Like Power BI reports are in star schema. I need a billion rows of star schema data. Um, so I wanted to do some testing, and then I ended up. Are you familiar with the term yak shaving?
No.
No. Okay. All right. You can Google it. It's pretty simple. So it's a piece of slang. It doesn't mean anything weird or dirty or anything like that. But it's basically whenever you start doing a task or a chore or whatever, and you're like, well, before I can really set up this notebook, I need to install Anaconda. And before I install Anaconda, I need to install this. And so it's like that if you give a mouse a cookie
Oh,
kind of chain of events.
that's exactly what I call it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it's basically like, your boss comes in and it's like, Christina, why isn't this report done? It's like, well, I'm busy shaving a yak right now. And as soon as I finish that, then I can do X and I can do Y. So it's the if you give a mouse a cookie kind of situation. And so that's why I'm like, well, okay, if I'm going to be benchmarking that, I should probably benchmark the load into these sources
Oh, and
and all this stuff.
hence
But
the
because people kept
latest.
asking about like compute units, how much does it cost, not just how fast it is. The reason for that whole story is you're right about the foundation piece because when I wanted to try and put this into SQL or what is it even called? Fabric Data Warehouse,
Yeah.
right? I tried to do a script create as for my local copy of the Contoso database.
Nice.
And it was like, oh, this is incompatible for a couple reasons. So one, because it's all based on Parquet, you don't have indexes,
No, you
right?
don't.
So it's like you don't have file groups, you don't have indexes. Throw that out, fine. And then it's like we don't have nchar and nvarchar. Those data types don't exist in Parquet.
Oh, Eugene,
Oh no.
I can't tell you how many hours I spent because I had to migrate a process that had a ton of varchar max columns
Oh
into
no.
a warehouse. So I
Yeah.
had to go in and change everything by hand to like varchar 8000.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I believe it, right? Because if I
Terrible.
recall, when you go past 8,000, like it moves it, was it like the off file store or whatever? I think they got Varchar Max in preview for some things now,
I
right?
would love that.
Yeah. I saw some sort of preview announcement. But the whole point is like you you think that, oh, well, pipes are just pipes,
Right.
right? And then you find out that like if you pick the wrong one, you've got lead pipes and
Mm-hmm.
you'll get poisoned, right? And so
Yes.
yeah, it makes sense. The faucet first approach kind of makes sense in that like the thing that's most likely to change and the thing that is easiest to change is going to be the front end.
Yep.
And so unless you have a very good idea of how you want the data to be shaped, you really don't want to start from the back end. But also there's a classic book called Rapid Development. So I recommend checking out. I guess it's a podcast full of show notes, so I'll put it in the show notes. Um, but it's about software development, but it talks about all the ways that it can fail and the ways that you deal with a project that's become a death march. And at the very first
Oh.
chapter, it talks about how consistently large projects take 50% longer than was estimated. And the problem is when it's a $2 million project, finding an extra $1 million in budget and time and the couch cushions is not so
Insane.
easy, right? And so there's so much more likely to fail. So, I mean that all makes sense. Um, Pivoting a little bit, so what are some other challenges you've run into moving around data and Fabric? How's that been?
Well, so I was so excited about Azure SQL Preview. I'm just gonna throw that out there. I
Okay.
am really excited for Azure SQL to be in Fabric. Um, Being able to have identity columns alone to me is so worth it. Not having to make my own incremental IDs and trust that nobody's going to manually insert rows
Oh,
themselves.
geez.
Um,
Yeah.
Things like that.
Side note, I don't even understand why SQL Warehouse is a thing. Like I get the some of the needs and stuff, but like it's like one of the features is you can insert rows with SQL.
Yep.
If this is supposed to be an append only analytical data store based off of Parquet,
Yep.
why would I insert rows with SQL? Like the whole point is that you take all, because I understand the VertiPack engine, so I just make assumptions about Parquet. The
Right.
whole point is you take a million rows and you scrunch them all down into a single file.
Yep.
And so what do you think happens when you insert 10 rows because Frank in accounting wanted to update a table? Well, it makes a little teeny tiny file, or depending on the engine, it'll kind of hold those in a holding area until it has enough to make a bigger file. But in
Right.
any case, it's bass backwards. It's basically, it just doesn't make sense.
It's not made for OLAP, right? Or is it
OLTP. So the
OLTP? That's
transaction,
the
yeah,
one.
OLAP
Thank
is
you.
cube, OLTP is transactions.
I literally always mix them up. Do I know what they mean when someone says them to me? Yes.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
I
yeah.
say them backwards all the time?
No worries.
And that's why I love Azure SQL. It's made for that. It's made for inserting those rows. It's like, yeah, this is
Turns out a transactional database was designed for transactions. It's just wild. Yeah,
what?
I know.
Yeah, and I think it works faster, in my opinion, in Power BI than a warehouse does.
Yeah, I'm interested. So the back to the yak shaving.
Mhm.
What I'm hoping to do is I want to test both like a full import because I
Mhm.
expect it to be way faster for that because my assumption is okay, you have a lake house, so you're converting column store into row store over the wire for
Yep.
TDS and then back in like whereas why not just store it as row store and send it over and then gonna test like 1% load on a date filter because that simulates incremental refresh. You
Oh,
know what I mean,
nice.
right?
Yeah.
And again, clustered index or non-clustered secondary index on date filters should get you that super fast. Whereas maybe if you're lucky with the data skipping for parquet, it'll get
Right.
you there if it's sorted on that. But I also learned this week, I knew and then I forgot that vOrder is a thing made up by Microsoft.
Correct.
Because because I'm like, well, wait. Someone was asking about like performance comparison between like direct lake and like import. I'm like, well, I think vOrder is just on one column because zorder is on multiple columns, but I don't know. And so I go on the Databricks subreddit and I'm asking, and I'm like, so can someone? I can't find any docs on this. And someone's like, what the heck's vOrder? And I'm like, is it a
Like,
Microsoft
whoops.
thing? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, great. I look dumb. Admittedly, I was told about this like when Fabric first came out, and it just fell out of my head. But
There's so much. There's so
yeah,
much to learn about all this stuff. It just
yeah.
feels like it's a drowning ocean, right? Like
And
the waves
hopefully
come.
hopefully this podcast will be like a little life preserver. That's the goal.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like, hey, you can duck this wave. We got you, you know? You don't
Yeah.
have to be swept up in it every time.
So uh so another question then. Um let's say we're in like have you ever played Animal Crossing?
No, I haven't, but
Oh, come on.
I I know.
It's fine. Well, the most recent one, like instead of being in a little cozy town, you're on a cozy tropical beach. So let's say I'm on my cozy tropical beach of Power Query, and I
Uh-huh.
know all the people there, and I'm in this ocean of overwhelm, right?
Yeah.
Um, so when would I use, say, notebooks if I understand Power Query and I can use data flows and all that kind of stuff? When would I leave? When I get in my boat and leave my cozy little island village?
So I have a hot take for you.
Okay,
When data flows start to break, that is when I would move. So I would
makes sense to
start
me.
learning it now if you can, if you've got that bandwidth in your day to day, if you see that your data flows are taking really long to refresh, you're seeing like, oh shoot, this is taking a lot of capacity,
Right,
you're just waiting for that tipping point moment. If you're there, try and start learning it now because you don't, the last thing you want to do, and this, I've been in this situation before where something finally breaks that you knew was going to break eventually because it
right.
was just,
The data kept getting bigger or
yeah,
wider or slower. Yeah.
your refresh was taking an hour 15 and you were like, if it's
And you hit that
taking,
2 hour window and you're like,
you're like, this
yeah,
is it, If it's getting to that point, that's when you should try and learn it instead of like, I've done this many times in my career. It hits that point, it breaks, and it's a business critical report. I'm now working 2 24-hour days to get it back
yeah,
online. You
yep.
don't want to be in that situation.
It's not a problem until it is. And that's I've talked about with Power BI in general, with like performance and scaling.
Yeah,
It's not a problem until it suddenly is because
exactly.
most of the time Power Query is doing query folding
Hmm.
and the Vertipack model is compressing everything really, really well, right? And so it covers a multitude of sins until
Yeah,
there's too much of a multitude and like you have to do that. And like learning the notebook stuff is hard. Like I was trying to do that, and first, my biggest complaint, if you want to add a new line in DAX, you hit Alt Enter because if you hit Enter,
oh,
heaven forbid, it'll just save it, right? Guess how it works in notebooks? If you need to add a new line, you hit Enter. If you do Alt Enter, Control Enter, or Shift Enter, it's going to run the code, which
I
may be
know.
expensive code, and then it may make a new cell. So there was that. And then I spent a good amount of time just trying to talk to ChatGPT to help me out. Now, I will say two features that they're doing, which are great, is they've got Data Wrangler.
Yes.
So it's like Power Query for Python. That's
Yep.
awesome. And they've got snippets.
Yep.
Um, but I still have yet to figure out the code I need to convert CSV to Delta and save it. So I need to do some research on that. And that's like
I
basic
have
stuff.
it saved some, like I've got a link, like a list of links
Oh,
right
nice.
now because it's hard. I agree with you. I've tried using ChatGPT to do this stuff and it doesn't know Fabric commands. It doesn't know that I need something in a Spark data
Yes.
frame.
Yes.
It doesn't
I
understand the difference.
I ran into that a lot. So I don't know if search is included in the free version. So for people who don't know, um, one, it's very important to be logged in if you're going to use ChatGPT. I don't know how it is for Copilot, but for ChatGPT, if you're like some rando on the internet and you don't have an account, they'll default you to 4.0 mini for the
Mm.
model, and you'll get categorically worse results. I pay for it, and so multiple times what I would have to do is I would ask it something, and if it was something older like Azure Portal, it was pretty good. But if it was something Fabric related, because it's so new,
Yeah.
it would be off. And what I just do is I just tell it research this. So it'll give me a bad answer. I'll tell it research
Oh.
this, and then it'll start doing like the Bing search, and then usually the answers are better. But even then, so like there's Notebook Utils
Yep.
library, formerly MS Spark Utils, and you've probably met Sandeep Pawar.
He's
He's like
awesome.
you should try Fast Copy for copying the CSV file. So it's in my benchmark, and the docs are very very sparse. And then he has a blog which is short but helpful. And so it was funny because I asked ChatGPT research this, and the only thing it found were those two things, right? So
Yeah.
even then, sometimes there's just not a ton of stuff out there, right? And I'm sure if someone like was using Spark all the time, they could figure it out.
Hmm.
Um, but for me, it was challenging.
Well, you know what's helped me the most is actually finding people who are doing things like the Senpai library, and
Oh,
it's
sure.
not explicitly called out what they're doing, but you can kind of learn from them the steps. Like, oh, this is how they made that kind of data frame. Oh, this is how they pulled the data in. So that's been helping me a lot. I also have been learning. I mean, I've been doing this for a few months now. I've
Yeah,
cut my teeth on it a bit,
yeah.
but I think one of the first things that got me off the starting block, and might be the same for other Power BI specific users, is looking at all the admin stuff you can do. So running
Okay.
things like from the Senpai library about my
Oh,
environment, that was interesting to me and got me learning the Python. So if you're trying to learn something and you're a Power BI admin, why not try that? And then at least you can learn it without having to do a bunch of crazy stuff.
yeah. That I think that makes sense because it's something practical and you're invested in. Because one of my biggest challenges, and this is like a personal roadblock when it comes to learning PySpark,
Mm.
is I have a Pluralsight subscription because I'm an author, and I have a LinkedIn Learning subscription, and I'll try to like watch a course. And the problem is it's like baby's first data frame, and they'll be like, how here's how you can filter data. Here's how you can project columns, and I'm like, I know SQL.
Yep.
Why would I do this? Even if I'm in Spark, I can do Spark SQL. You know what
Yep.
I mean?
Mhm.
And so there's so much stuff that does not properly show off the power and capability and efficiencies of Spark
Mm.
because it's like they're just doing it a different way, and
Right.
it's so hard to understand that breaking point that you talk about, right? What is the straw that breaks the camel's back that would cause me to go to PySpark? If I know Power Query and I know SQL, I can get 95, 99% of what I need done and decently well, especially if I know how to push it back. It's
Yeah.
when you start getting into like certain scenarios where it's like, okay, no, you really need to learn some Spark. And
Well,
identifying those is hard, right?
it is. I always think of it this way, like path of least resistance, my friend. So I tend to put whatever I can in SQL, especially if I'm working with teams that are SQL oriented, right?
Yeah.
SQL is their strong suit.
It's the universal language of data other than
Yeah.
Excel, and we really should not put it in
No,
Fabric,
don't do that. Yeah. But can you imagine running DAX queries as your ETL strategy? Oh my gosh. Kill
I
me.
I will say I did some earlier benchmarks with local sources just to test it. So the fastest one I tested, file formats or like
Mhm.
SQL, local SQL, was Parquet. No brainer. Do you want to guess what the second fastest format was? This is a file type.
JSON.
JSON was awful. MS Access.
MS Access.
MS Access. Parquet. Parquet took 7 seconds to read 100 million rows of sales data. MS Access took 9.
What?
Everything else was taking like CSV and stuff was taking like 17, and then JSON was like 50. It was awful.
Oh, I just
Um,
threw JSON out there because I was like,
It's so bad.
It's
It's
not gonna be
so bad.
CSV. It's
Yeah,
gonna
no,
be
MS
ASCII.
Access. That's the big
Huh.
data technology of the future. It was like 10 times as big. Like it was literally like half a gigabyte for the file, and now it only goes up to 2 gigabytes. So it doesn't compress like Parquet, but if you need to read with Power BI, just
I guess. Yeah.
yeah. All right. So I think we're starting to come up on time.
Oh yes.
Two quick questions. So one, what is your favorite Fabric feature, if you can
My
think of something,
favorite fabric.
or your least favorite? We can bash on it. It's up to you.
I'll go negative then positive because I don't want to be
Yeah,
negative
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
I like using it.
Compliment sandwich. Let's do it.
Yep. So the negative for me, merge and identity statements in a warehouse,
Okay.
and I can't query anything from the SQL endpoint inside of Azure SQL, which to me is bonkers.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
would love to be able to just insert from my lakehouse directly into an Azure SQL environment. Right
yeah.
now, can't do that. Uh, Things I love and adore. Number one has to be no longer having to call Power BI REST APIs and just using the
Oh,
Senpai notebook. I have made my own like tenant activity trackers because I don't love the built-in ones.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that has been amazing.
Oh, that's
That
awesome.
and best practice analyzer, having that just built into my processes now.
It's built. It works with Senpai. Is that what?
Oh yeah, so
That's awesome.
semantic link labs,
I
highly
this is
recommend.
moving higher up on my backlog of things to learn. Michael Kowalski is everywhere. It's
He
creepy.
is.
Like, because I was trying to list out for my course, I was trying to list out tools for performance tuning, and it's like, all right, so he wrote the best practice analyzer for the model and for reporting, and he's involved with like the link labs and all this stuff. And it's like, when does this man sleep?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I need to learn more of that. And so then the other question is, where can people find you? There's like 20 social networks now, and then like, is there anything you want to I can't think of the word, but like, pitch, push, publish, anything you're doing, or just like, I don't know.
Yeah, so I co-write a blog with my dad, so it's a technical blog, dataonwheels.com.
Yep, perfect.
Definitely love doing that with him. I'm also on LinkedIn, and then I'm on X and Blue Sky. So, but I check
Yeah,
LinkedIn the most. It's
the
probably a good
the
way to
the
put that.
pain is real if you want to have any sort of personal brand or marketing presence. My
Yeah.
link tree is like a mile long, you know, but very cool. Well,
Yeah.
it has been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much, and I'm glad you could share some of your expertise.
Thanks. Yeah, this was great.